the system of apartheid came in at the middle part of the 20th century in South Africa. It came through and was birthed through a system of sort of European settler colonial imperialism stroke institutional racism. This colonialism, settlerism had its functioning and its origin in European colonialism and imperialism from the middle part of the 16th century all the way through into the 19th and the 20th century. Apartheid didn't just arrive from nowhere. It is part and parcel of a policy of European settler domination in Southern Africa and part of a European imperialism in the continent of Africa. So this imperialism and colonialism began in many ways with people like Prince Henry the Navigator attempting to circumnavigate the continent of Africa for the hope of finding new routes to the east. And with people like Bartolomeu Diaz also trying to do something quite similar. But the settlers, the European settlers in the continent of Africa, in Southern Africa, tended to be, up until the 18th and the 19th century, mostly those fleeing persecution, like the Afrikaners who were arriving from the Netherlands. These were people at the lower end of the power structure in the Netherlands, and they arrived as dispossessed people, often in fact people who'd been highly discriminated against in Europe. And as they arrived in the continent of Africa, they sought to make the continent of Africa their home. As a dispossessed people, they adopted a policy of separation from the people that they came across. Now, who were those people that they came across? These were people that had been here for tens of thousands, perhaps even longer years. People like the San, the Khoikhoi people, people of African descent. Later, Bantu people arrived in the lower part of the continent of Africa. Perhaps some say from the middle part of the 14th or the 15th century, some say much earlier. So these various different sets of people, Bantu and San people, Khoikhoi people, make up the original stock of the African people. Amongst those Bantu people, we have people such as the Zulu people, and the Matabele. The Xhosa people are the result of the exchange or the interchange between these various sets of people. So these African peoples make up the original populations of this region. Now, this is very, very important because later history books written by European settlers would claim that in fact the Afrikaners are original and that they were there before the Bantu people. Evidence doesn't support such an argument, even though people do put the argument quite forcefully. The evidence doesn't seem to support that. The evidence seems to support that the Bantu peoples arrived in Southern Africa at an earlier date than most Afrikaners arrived within the continent of Africa. Having said that, of course, Portuguese explorers have been coming to the Cape of Good Hope, since the 15th century. So the important point is that Southern Africa wasn't uninhabited. It wasn't a wasteland waiting for, it wasn't a wasteland where Europeans were discovering a new land devoid of people, devoid of culture, devoid of inverted commas civilization. There were civilizations, peoples, and firm nations already established in the continent of Africa before Europeans began to settle in these regions and began to claim these regions as their own. The claiming of these regions as their own has got nothing to do with the idea that these regions were uninhabited or uninhabitable. These people had been there for thousands of years, perhaps even tens of thousands of years in many cases. The initial intention of European interactions in Southern Africa come about as a result of the desire for trade. This helps us to understand that apart from people like the Afrikaners, the vast majority of Europeans were interested in Southern Africa for its proximity to the trade that they wished to initiate, either within the continent of Africa or accordingly trade around the Cape of Good Hope and as it connected to the continent of Asia. With the exception of Afrikaners, up until the 18th or 19th century, the vast majority of Europeans weren't thinking of making South Africa their home. This began to change in the 18th century, in particular because of the vast amount of resources, minerals and other resources that were discovered in the continent of Africa, especially in southern Africa. It was found that gold, silver, and a host of other precious metals, as well as other metals such as iron, were located in southern Africa. And therefore, a succession of European empires began to claim southern Africa as their own. The Portuguese, the Germans in Namibia, and later on, the British. So the British in the 18th century, as they began to expand in the continent of Africa, and as people later on, such as Cecil Rhodes, sought to claim the entire continent of Africa as their own, saw South Africa as a prize. Now, this is on the backdrop of what was happening in other parts of the empire. Since the 18th century, Britain had lost control of what became the United States of America. The losing of the United States of America meant that many British imperialists began to see the continent of Africa as a pearl in their prize of sort of global domination that included, by the 18th and the 19th century, vast parts of the Indian subcontinent, which at that time was being controlled by the East India Company. So the new places of British colonial exploitation included the Indian subcontinent and the continent of Africa. A key feature of this colonial imperial domination was settler colonial imperial domination, so that by the middle part or the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century, British colonials were arriving in southern Africa, settling in southern Africa, and claiming vast areas, vast territories as their own. The intent was, as Cecil Rhodes claims, to make a kingdom from Cape to Cairo. This is a kingdom for Europeans, a kingdom in which the entire continent of Africa was to be used for the benefit of Europe and European power. In particular, Cecil Rhodes saw the continent of Africa as a place for the British Empire. In other words, that the British Empire would claim the entire continent of Africa as its own, and that this would form a mainstay or central part of what made the British Empire powerful. This is very important in our understanding of how apartheid came into effect and why, and how the African people in the continent of Africa could be seen as expendable, or if not expendable, as a mere commodity to be used by whichever imperial nation had gained control of the region in which they occupied. So the system of apartheid emerged in this context as part of settler colonial imperialism, as part of the destruction of African civilizations. In the 19th century, a policy of destroying the Matabele, of destroying the Zulus, of destroying the Xhosa, of destroying the Shona in southern Africa, meant that these kingdoms became annexed and part of wider British imperial colonial states such as South Africa, colonial states such as Namibia in the case of Germany, or colonial states such as Angola, colonial states such as Zimbabwe, which was then called Rhodesia. So these colonial states were part of colonial empires, literally part of Britain, or part of Portugal, or part of Germany. Within these colonial states, colonial laws were enforced. These colonial laws, for the most part, were extraordinarily racist, and fundamentally and institutionally racist, denying African people, for example, equal rights with the Europeans, and often relegating them to a status inferior, an inferior status, often not even granting them fundamental human rights, that we would consider to be fundamental as a human being. As part of this colonial domination, the European powers often, but especially in South Africa, began to encourage the migration of people from the Indian subcontinent. At first, so that this new labour would form an indentured labour to replace Africans who in many cases were disappearing, or that this new labour would come in and form a middle class, a buffer class of sort of semi-academic civil servants to administer the colonial interests. So this meant that parts of Southern Africa became ethnically diverse, with people of, from the Indian subcontinent forming a separate class within South Africa and within other territories as well. Another key feature that had been happening since the 17th century is the relationships taking place between people of European descent and women in particular of African descent. These people of mixed heritage were often classified as separate from people of African descent who had a mother and father of African descent. This separate form of categorization was part of a policy, a colonial policy that predates apartheid. It's part of a colonial policy implemented by the British, by the Portuguese, by the Dutch, wherever they were, and by the Afrikaners. So this is important because later on we will see how the system of apartheid inherited the kind of colonial settler institutional racism that separated people into distinct categories: white, coloured, Asian or Indian, and Bantu or African.